Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another installment of our supply chain deep dive series. Today, we will be talking about the Electronic Product Code Information Services, or EPCIS. EPCIS is quickly transforming supply chain digitization. It is shifting the conversation from transaction-based supply chain to event-based supply chain traceability. To talk more about this, I am joined today by Ned Mears from GS1 US and Matt Andrews. Ned, Matt, thank you for joining me to talk about this topic. For those who are not familiar with your organization and your role and how GS1 US fits into this puzzle of traceability and supply chain digitization, can you take us through a little bit of a history of what GS1 US is and how GS1 and EPCS have come about?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having us. I'm Ned Mears with GS1 US. Matt and I are both on our standards team. So we get involved in sort of supply chain related discussions wherever, let's say, the rubber meets the road and people are applying these global data standards to solve business problems. So zooming that out to your question, GS1 is a global federation of member organizations, and the way that we operate is by having work group and consensus based standards management, where we're developing data standards around identification, data capturing, and data sharing. And then that filters through the federation from our global office that owns the standards to member organizations in each country. So Matt and I represent the United States. We are here to advocate for those US business processes on the global stage and also translate global standards down to be applied in the sort of local US market. So, what we're talking about today around EPCIS, traceability, food safety, especially as it relates to the FSMA 204 requirements, it's a sort of a nice snapshot of what I just described, right? So, we have a global standard in EPCIS. This is, as you mentioned, all built around supply chain event data. So getting a sort of realistic picture of what actually is taking place in the supply chain in a data model that came out of a lot of the early standardization work from the RFID industry. So serialized data exchange that is happening with RFID tags, the automation of reading those tags as items move in and out of different environments. EPCIS is really the data model that gives you that snapshot of every time a tag passes through a reader, what information are we going to spin up and store in a database to record that sort of movement, that event, right? How do we characterize that and put it in context? So here in the US, regulations from the FDA, like the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or DSCSA, and the Food Safety Modernization Act, Rule 204, which we're really going to talk about today, those regulations are really built around traceability, more finite identity of these items, either serial numbers, lot codes, things like that. And it's really what EPCIS was intended to do in terms of giving visibility back to the supply chain. So we're taking those global standards, looking at the most modern version, and then putting the practical advice out there for the US market.
Very interesting. And obviously, all three of us are very enmeshed in the world of traceability, right? But if you're not in this, you look at traceability and you think of a very particular type of construct. Right now, what we're seeing, however, is predominantly what we would call a transaction-based traceability paradigm, right? And EPCS seems to shift that conversation towards an event-based traceability paradigm, which you also alluded to. Can you just very briefly explain what the differences are between those two? Because I think they're quite different, and they lead to somewhat different outcomes, right?
Sure. So getting into, I guess, maybe two different types of data that are captured and exchanged amongst trading partners in the supply chain. And this is really where I think the GS1 system of standards seeks to describe these different forms of data and establish standards to represent this type of data that might be shared. You have this concept of transaction data and what we call visibility event data. The best way to describe transaction data is really it's electronic documents that are exchanged between trading partners to signal their intentions in terms of how they're going to move goods between them. So, for example, if we take two parties in the supply chain, perhaps a distributor and a supplier, for example, the transaction data that the distributor is going to send to the supplier is an intention to acquire a certain amount of goods from that upstream supplier. So perhaps a handful of GTINs and then certain quantities of those GTINs, being GTIN, of course, being the trade item identification number. And then from there, once the goods have been prepared to ship physically to the downstream party, additional transaction data is shared in the form of documents such as advanced shipment notices or dispatch advices, depending on the geography that you're in. They're basically two equivalent forms of the document, but in North America versus, say, Europe, they have different terminology. These are documents that are signaling how the upstream party that has the goods to send to the downstream party is going to send them in their specific configuration in terms of, say, pallets, cases, cartons, what have you. And then for the payment of those goods, they're also going to then send a digital invoice based on a specific structure that a transaction set would define for the payment of those goods. And so really where you get into things like electronic data interchange standards is those standards are providing ways that trading partners can structure those electronic documents that, again, are signaling intentions between trading partners for the exchange of goods, but it doesn't necessarily reflect truly the physical actions that are taking part in the supply chain. So when we're talking about data that represents what truly occurs into the supply chain down even to the serial item level, this is where we're talking about a concept called visibility event data. And what that type of data does is it represents the actual process instances that occur in the supply chain. And these could very well be process instances that are carried out in reaction to transaction documents. So for example, if we take our two parties again, the supplier or the downstream distributor or the upstream supplier, once that purchase order lands at the supplier, the physical actions that then take place to fulfill that order are, for example, picking cases of product off of a warehouse shelf, putting them and assembling them onto a specific pallet and giving that pallet, perhaps a very specific identifier like a serialized shipping container code. And then from there, that pallet has additional physical movements to effectively then arrive at the receiving party's location. So it's then perhaps moved to a loading dock, put onto a shipping container on a truck. That truck then leaves the facility, arrives at the downstream facility, then is unpacked and put into inventory. So when we're talking about the EPCIS standard, what that standard seeks to do is provide, in a very similar way to EDI, where the EDI standards are providing that standardized way of structuring electronic transaction documents so that they can be shared and interpreted in mass in the supply chain. EPCIS is serving that very similar purpose, although the data is going to be at a much more granular level, that process level of the supply chain. And if we were to actually look at all of the EPCIS event data in relation to one specific object that's a serialized object, or perhaps quantities of lot level defined objects, we can know their entire history of how they existed in the supply chain. And then if we also were to look at that data in the context of a location, we can get very granular insights into the actual physical ongoings in that location in relation to the handling of goods in the supply chain. So when it comes to traceability, it really is a way of modeling data in the supply chain and a way of standardizing the way that data is represented so that it can be applied in mass and understood by many for any item that might be under some type of, say, for example, traceability regulation, or if there is some relationship between supply chain parties that they're agreeing to share that level of data amongst them between the objects that they're moving back and forth between each other.
So let me double click on that because you mentioned a few elements there that I think are rather important, right? You mentioned advanced shipment notices, EDIs, and whatnot, and I think that there's perhaps a perception, if you're familiar with EDIs, that you will be shipping something, you'll send out an EDI 856, and you may assume that that contains all the information you need for traceability. So how may that be an incomplete picture, and how does that compare to what EPCIS does? And I think combined with that, because you may end up ending up in discussions where you may be trying to achieve traceability through 856, right? And then along comes EPCIS. So do they compete? Do they complement? How can those standards? Because so far EDI is a mainstay, right? Predominantly when you share, unless you're in pharma because of DCSEA, EDI is a mainstay. How do those standards complement, compete, work together?
Yeah, no, excellent question. And I think this kind of goes back to one of the things that I had sort of mentioned in that previous spiel about how if we think about signaling business intention and getting the flow of goods started in the supply chain, there has to be some sort of mechanism that a downstream party can leverage to signal to an upstream supplier of those goods, whether it's a distributor to supplier or retailer to distributor, that I want to acquire a certain number of goods from you, and these are the specific ones and quantities. So transaction data plays a role there in that it's basically the initial business signal of I'm looking to acquire a certain number of goods. So that's what essentially a purchase order is used for. So that is what we would call an example of transaction data shared from a downstream party to an upstream party. Now, that signals only an intention to get supply chain goods moving. What actually is going to then model the physical flow of goods is going to be, again, what we call that visibility event data, where even down to the singular process of taking that product off of the warehouse shelf, visibility event data with the EPCIS standard can actually be used to model that specific occurrence. And then that piece of data can then be triggered into another system to say that these goods that were once of, say, for example, of a sellable inventory status are no longer of that status because they're being physically pulled off the shelf to fulfill the needs of a specific purchase order. And that's where we kind of see potentially the overlap of those two standards, as you might have mentioned already, where, for example, if we think about certain other things that visibility event data can tell us, say, for example, in a retail apparel store environment where we have perhaps 25,000, RFID tagged apparel items such as, t-shirts, shoes, what have you. Visibility event data not only encompasses those processes that are carried out in the supply chain to fulfill the needs of shared transaction data, but it's also internal information about what is going on with inventory and what is the status of our inventory as well. So, for example, if we're using EPCIS visibility event data to reflect the exact EPCs that we saw during an inventory cycle count in a retail store, that is something that only, for example, EPCIS would apply because there is no real downstream transaction document that is initiating that cycle counting process. It's only an internally handled process that is really for the benefit of that particular owner of that retail store environment. So it's really a four walls process at that point. But again, if we think about certain actions that are carried out that complement transaction data. For example, if we're putting together a pallet due to a purchase order requirement and we want to link that purchase order to that physical process, that's where there's kind of the bridging of the gap, so to speak, where the physical actions that were taking place and representing with EPCIS actually are in direct reaction to a piece of transaction data. So we might want to link those two pieces of data there to kind of show that these are the actions directly involved with that purchase order. And there's others that might be in that same realm. So, for example, when we go to perhaps log a piece of visibility event data or EPCIS event data for the shipping of that product, we might want to include a reference to either a dispatch advice or to an advanced shipment order or even a bill of lading at that point. So I think that's really where you have some significant differentiations, where transaction data really is business-to-business signaling of intentions they wish to take towards each other, towards the flow of goods. You have visibility event data, which is really modeling purely down to that process instance level what is truly occurring in these facilities. And again, there might be times where that visibility event data collaborates with transaction data, but there are also situations where that is not the case.
So information contained within an EDI or transaction or other transaction-based layers could be, therefore, complemented with EPCIS in the sense that you could take the information that is within the EDI and then reposit it within an EPCIS construct.
Yeah. And I think the main thing that's important to keep in mind with EPCIS and this notion of visibility event data is that, again, when we talk about transaction data, there's always this notion of intention or commitment. That's kind of the spirit of the data. It's like, as businesses, we're committing towards taking these actions and acquiring these specific goods, and that's signaled through these documents. The spirit of visibility event data and EPCIS events, which again, EPCIS events really you can think of them as just pieces of visibility event data that follow a specific structure according to the EPCIS standard. That's really essentially what EPCIS events are. But really I would say that the spirit of an EPCIS event versus a piece of EDI versus an EDI document, let's say, is that EPCIS event is very much intended to reflect what truly happened in the supply chain. Now, that could potentially not be the case. You do have mechanisms within the standard to do things like error correction, where if you say if this specific EPCIS event was either erroneous or it actually never happened and it was generated for perhaps a reason that's maybe not unknown or maybe just something again happened that had its generation occur that wasn't intended. There's mechanisms to correct that within the standard, but I would say more significantly than EDI, it's supposed to be data that is a reflection of what truly happened versus a business intention towards another business. So I think that's another significant thing where if you are using, I think you were trying to say maybe EDI related data to then generate EPCIS data, I would say that there certainly would have to be a high confidence in the accuracy of that EDI data to do so. And again, it is really kind of the spirit of the EPCIS data, where it's truly supposed to reflect exactly what happened as much as it could possibly be acquired.
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to contribute here is in a business context where you can easily understand this, or where some of that system data, transactional data process might start to fall apart, is substitutions, right? So especially with things like produce or food items, things that are high expiry potential, or they're let's say for example grown in a field, right? It is very difficult to predict at some points. I want to order this many of that commodity product, let's call it tomatoes, right? I know what item I want from my supplier, but the week before that, weather patterns changed and I can't get that exact item. So there is a real time process of substitution that may have to take place. And then reconciling all of that data that went back and forth can become kind of challenging. EPCIS, because its intent is to really reflect the physical process, assuming all those EPCIS events are built from scan data. So I have barcodes of boxes going onto pallets, all the associations, the aggregation is all built into the data from reality. That can provide a very clear picture to what product actually was shipped, the final quantity that was shipped. Any substitutions can be known. Again, if you're capturing the identity right from the physical item. So it's an example of where very quick sort of agile business processes reacting to demand, especially dealing with things there's external factors like produce and harvested high expiry items like that. EPCIS can play a huge benefit in providing a trusted source of data you could then even use to reconcile the transactional data that came before it.
Absolutely.
I think those data demands and that data architecture that is built into EPCIS is very reflective of the demands that we're seeing emerge in the regulatory sphere when it comes to traceability. And I think that perhaps nowhere is that more clear, I think, than in what we are seeing right now with FISMA Section 204 and the demand that that places on traceability, where perhaps in some scenarios, if you're predominantly a pass-through, I think EDIs may be perhaps sufficient to be able to create the information demanded. But if you're an operation that is somewhat more complex, an operation that transforms, an operation that touches, repackages products and whatnot, I think the EPCIS architecture seems to be very attuned to the demands of the key data elements and critical tracking events that are enmeshed within the rule. So I guess how do you see EPCIS supporting FISMA 204 compliance, also knowing that perhaps at the moment, if we compare with some other industries, like we discussed about the pharma industry, EPCIS adoption is still relatively low within the affected industry for FISMA 204?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So I think to answer that most effectively, it's first useful to zoom out on each of the critical tracking events that the FDA is asking for the foods on the list, and then also make, I think, a couple key notes about the shipping CTE specifically, because I think that's the one where we are seeing a lot of our membership kind of heavily lean into the shipping notice or the dispatch advice at this moment in time. But EPCIS very much is being looked at, I think, for the rest of them. And then I think, again, Ned kind of alluded to it, but EPCIS and event data, as it essentially is reflecting any process that could occur from start to finish in the life cycle of any product that exists. It's something that could serve as the source of truth for traceability data, certainly in the long term, I would say. Just taking a moment to step back on the critical tracking events. So the ones that you have are, the harvesting event, the cooling event, shipping and receiving events, first land-based receiver, and transformation. So harvesting, of course, is just simply, removing the product from, say, like a farm field or a tree in the farm. Cooling is that, that post-harvest process of getting the temperature of the goods down to encourage, freshness as it continues to move throughout the supply chain. I think the one actually I forgot was initial packing. So it's basically taking it from, say, like the raw commodity to an actual, packed trade item at that point. Transformation is either taking that previous packaging configuration, converting it to another, or combining ingredients together for a new food product that moves from the supply chain going forward. And then you have first land-based receiver, which is that first party that takes, wild-caught seafood product from the vessel-owning party, and it's a new party establishing a traceability lot code from that point. And then, of course, shipping and receiving. So the main one that our membership is kind of leaning into at the moment with an EDI based approach is the shipping CT. And the reasons really for that is you have a number of key data elements in that critical tracking event that we've identified that can all actually be contained within the EDI document itself. And it also has another particular requirement in the sense that when that food product is shipped, those key data elements actually have to travel with the food as well. So the receiving party has to receive those shipping KDEs as well. And that's really, I think, you have the combination of industry's familiarity and adoption with the 856 advanced shipment notice, as well as, again, the capabilities of that particular transaction document type and that standard to contain the data elements without really any kind of massive expansion or custom data elements. It's really why our membership is kind of leaning into that initially to get those data elements moving down the supply chain that the regulation says that you have to. But if you look at some of the other ones, like, for example, even receiving or transformation especially, and I would say cooling, first land-based receiving, these are things that, for example, the receiving critical data element doesn't have to be signaled back upstream to the supplier, and it's really something that I think we see a fair amount of parties capturing, for example, in their WMS systems today once the goods, come into their environments. And then if you look at, for example, say harvesting processes, cooling processes, transformation processes, these are largely, I would say, processes that are one internal to the party that is generating the data for them. And also EDI doesn't really have any kind of significant, elegant model to represent them with either. So, for example, a transformation event. If we look at the different types of events that EPCIS is capable of generating, these event types, you have things like object events, aggregation events, transformation events. Depending on that type of event that you're working on, it provides different ways of modeling the actual objects that you're handling. And so if we zoom into the transformation critical tracking event for FSMA, it's asking you specifically, what are you starting with? What are you producing? And where did you produce it and when? So if we look at a transformation type EPCIS event, that basically spells out the structure of a transformation type event in EPCIS to a T. So it has input elements, it has output elements, of course, a read point and an event time like any other event that you might generate with the standard. So out of the box, so to speak, EPCIS is actually really quite ready to go for producing transformation event data, as well as initial packing event data as well. Because again, you can think about initial packing essentially as transformation as well, where you're converting, say, in the case of transformation in the food supply chain, it's maybe a finished trade item to another finished trade item. In initial packing, you're perhaps transforming raw commodity into a finished trade item that may be transformed, further on the supply chain, but it's still establishing raw commodity into like a packed trade item that is of a, like a case configuration, let's say. And then, for example, again, harvesting and cooling, these are more internal processes and calling for general product movement data that might not need, for example, the structure that, say, a shipment notice might have, such as, for example, a pallet. You certainly could and would maybe be encouraged to use pallets if the situation calls for it. But the way that EPCIS is configured to really model the generation of goods into the supply chain for the first time, such as with things like object commissioning events and just general product movements like object observe events, moving in and out of cooling locations and noting the temperature of that, for example. Again, the cooling critical tracking event per the FDA doesn't require that in their data that you have to have the temperature related information, but there's significant value add to EPCIS in that during that cooling process, you can actually include that temperature related data. And we're starting to see an appetite for more sharing of temperature related data during like in transit processes also. So I think when it comes down to the type of processes that EPCIS is capable of modeling versus what EDI is able to do elegantly and always what EDI was intended to do, I think when we look at the broad scope of the FSMA 204 regulation, EPCIS is really well equipped to, I think, able to be handling really any of the critical tracking events with its broad nature of being able to represent any supply chain process that a goods can go through. But when we look at EDI, it's really with the shipping critical tracking event specifically, it's industry was kind of looking at that as this is probably the quickest way we can at least get those required data elements moving as the regulation says that we have to. And we really only had to make perhaps some additional modifications, such as including a lot number rather than just G10, and including an additional location element as a part of that as well.
So if I were a company, right, and I had, let's say, to comply with the CSCA or FISMA 204, or simply I'm looking to achieve better traceability throughout my organization, and currently, obviously, I've invested in EI-oriented infrastructure, over the last decade. How would I go about shifting that? And obviously, as I said, not setting EDI aside, but how would I go about implementing an EPCIS centric infrastructure and processes?
Yeah, sure. Excellent question. So I think with any new technology, if we first look at it from a business level perspective and trying to perhaps justify the implementation of this new type of technology, I think there has to be a realization that if we are looking to have a much more granular picture of our supply chain and of the ongoings of the movement of goods, say within our locations, I think there has to be a commitment first towards knowing that there's going to be process changes and perhaps other technologies that might have to be implemented to acquire that data in the most accurate way possible. So, for example, if we look at our processes today in the warehouse to fulfill an order, if we're not doing any type of scanning to fulfill those orders today, in our pick pack processes and in our pallet construction processes and in our ASN generation processes, if getting that extra visibility requires perhaps scanning barcodes or perhaps implementing RFID technologies to perhaps reduce maybe the labor element of barcode scanning, or if we actually have to take a closer look at the quality of the barcodes that we're even able to scan, for example. One of the things that I think we hear a lot about is people, I think, wouldn't mind necessarily adding scanning or considering more scanning into their processes, but a lot of times the labels that they're getting aren't necessarily the most scannable on earth. And so that's really where I think when you talk about, and Neb, I think we'll get to this in the 2D discussion, but you have a more advanced, even more advanced barcode technologies that can help sort of alleviate some of those pain points. But I think it's really if you're making a commitment towards getting this more granular data into your supply chain, I think with any new technology, it really requires an evaluation and then probably some significant amount of initial changes in the processes and deployments of other technologies. But there also is this realization that even if, for example, we are implementing this to best meet the needs that the FDA has put on us for the FISMA 204 regulation, I think there also just has to be a realization that if you're accounting for the movement of your goods in that much more granular detail, that can be used in so many more other applications other than just meeting the regulation needs. So, for example, if you wanted to have a capability of reducing things like the amount of time that you're spending with your downstream trading partners, if there's a shipping discrepancy or a short shipment, if you're able to capture with EPCIS or visibility event data what you're actually using in the construction of your pallets down to that that fine grain level, there's potentially a return on your investment there. Where if your shipments are more accurate, then you don't have to necessarily spend a lot of resources resolving things like claims and shipping discrepancies. If you have more real-time data potentially that's captured again from the processes themselves and submitted to a repository in near real time, maybe you're only capable of doing end-of-day processing today, whereas maybe you could do queries on event data, say in any time interval that you might want, to perhaps update your systems in a more real-time and accurate manner. So I think it's one, I think, committing towards, if you do want as a business, this greater visibility into your supply chain. There's a number of process changes and process evaluations, I think, that have to go along with that. And I think that really goes for any new technology, whether it's a new ERP system, new WMS, what have you. And then I think it's really just understanding that the more data that you have about the ongoings of your supply chain, it not only helps you meet the regulation, which is something you have to do, but there's just an enormous amount of benefits in relation to, I think, inventory management, sustainability claims. Visibility just helps in so many more assets of the business. And I think it's realizing that as well.
Yeah, very interesting. I think you bring forward that idea of, in essence, well, on the one hand, we were talking about how to architect the data, right? We're also saying at some point you need to capture the data, you need to capture the event that takes place, and not everybody's necessarily putting barcodes on. Although I think now that's going to change in terms of what FISMA 4 is requiring. where we're going to begin seeing more barcodes on products. But that also brings the discussion that I think is rather germane to this as well is digital link. To me, the great promise of supply chain visibility is not just know what happens within my supply chain, but really being able to architect the entire construct from start to finish, right? Including point of sale and in engaging the consumer as part of that process. So far, if you look at the standard 128 that gets placed on pilots or products, it's great technology, right? But it's we're talking about like 1970s, right? Sort of technology. We've moved beyond that, and that's why I like the digital link. Can you talk about that? I think Ned, I'm looking at you. Can you guide us through and explain to the audience what digital link is, what it does, and why I think it's so cool?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does touch a bit on that prior conversation as well, right? Looking at the problem that you're trying to solve, right? So if we're talking about traceability, for example, you can look at something like FSMA. Okay, how do I meet the regulation? And that's sort of studying for the test, right? Like I want to know the material so I get a good grade on the test. I want to make sure I give the FDA what they need, right? Totally critical to doing business. But if it's approached with the mentality of if I use, for example, EPCIS for this, right? It's actually the newest version of the standard where all of those identifiers are represented with digital link. They're represented in a web native format within the EPCIS standard. Then you can start to build that out with the goal of just having more visibility and approaching it as a traceability exercise, right? I want the visibility to these physical products. I want the accessibility of the data. I want other trading partners to be able to interact and understand this, right? And I want to do that in this case with EPCIS 2.0 and forward in a way that is also developer friendly and modern, right? So easy to exchange, lightweight, and has all the sort of web enabled pieces to it. So digital link is a really important piece of the GS1 sort of system of standards. It's one of the newer pieces of it. It's not one of the core standards, let's say, that came from 70s barcode technology and sort of limitations there. And it really does bridge the physical and digital environments, right? So if you're talking about a problem like receive accuracy, today you might get data across from an EDI message, and then you receive a pallet with a 128 barcode with the SSCC. So I've identified this logistics unit, sent you some data. There's so many reasons why those might be mismatched. And some of those come down to barcodes not being able to be read, the host systems not being connected to the labeling system, or vice versa. The receiving system scanning that SSCC, but it doesn't actually see the data that's behind it. There's some mismatch that's taking place there. In any of those existing or sort of traditional business processes, you, as a downstream party, you're inheriting the quality or lack of quality from everyone upstream. So labeling, barcoding, quality identifiers, all of that stuff, the quality of the data you're getting, you're inheriting all of that. So it really is an important thing, again, focusing on this as a traceability exercise. I want quality data coming in. I want quality data on the physical items. Therefore, I want high quality data capture technology that's going to be able to feed all of that reliably. So you really do have to zoom all the way down to how is this being labeled and what type of automation or technology can I put on that package to get the best possible data into the computer systems, right? So digital link sort of opens up all those doors. If you think about that traditional UPC barcode or a GS1 128, a linear barcode, you're essentially getting a string of data, all those identification numbers, perhaps the batch lot, things like that. In a 128, we have more capacity. And if you sort of flip that paradigm, move to a QR code that now also has a web address, a domain name, right, as the sort of initial stem for that identifier, that just opens up a whole new realm of possibilities, right? So you can configure scanning systems, scanning applications, smartphones, and all kinds of other devices to then add additional data from other sources, because again, it is a link to a digital environment, right? So not only are you scanning that barcode, getting that key identifier that I'm going to pull data down from, but I can also use that barcode and the way that it's structured to sort of ping many other additional sources potentially to find out about this pallet, about this product, about this case, whatever that might be. So if we look at those two things combined, having this data model with EPCIS built on a JSON framework, friendly to modern developers, and it uses digital link as a way to build out those identifiers. You're also talking about a data packet sent from one trading partner to the next that is basically a set of links to other assets, right? So I've got this core identifier, this SSCC, digital link string. I can then use the link in that data that's been provided to me to access those other additional data sources as well. So you're adding the backing of internet technology, you're adding the backing of being able to resolve, redirect to multiple different data sources, both physically labeled on the product, but also in the data that you're exchanging back and forth, right? So it really does just connect the physical digital, right? They're not necessarily separate things at this point. And the more we get into this traceability mentality, having traceability as the goal, it is let's focus on the quality of the identifier, quality of the data carrier, the most robust, most readable, most accurate 3D and QR codes have a lot of those advantages, but also having the right data structure that moves from physical to digital very easily, right? And provides so many more benefits in terms of the data it can give you access to.
Yeah, in a future state, in my imagination, right, my desire is I go to the checkout at my local supermarket and I buy a product, it gets scanned. The product having a digital link gets connected to the rest of the information on the product supply chain prior to the checkout. And for me as a consumer, being able to engage through that same identifier, that same barcode on the product, and be able to get a contextualized experience through that product, right? That connects perhaps the information on the supply chain, maybe information on transparency, maybe ESG information, or maybe let's say there's a recall, be able to get that information as a scan, knowing that where that product was sold, connect to the checkout, connect to consumer, alert them on recalls. But all of that requires an infrastructure, right? If we look at the infrastructure that's in place at the point of sales, most of the supermarkets, they may not yet perhaps be 2D enabled. So what is the industry doing about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously a big initiative coming from GS1, right? Something that we're driving is Sunrise 2027. You also hear the term Ambition 2027 sometimes. Same principle. It really is looking at we have this vision of the future, right? Of more, as I said before, capable data carriers, web enablement, right? Greater traceability and access to that upstream data, right? A lot of those business challenges start to be solved the more you have access to this higher quality data and a more granular identity of the products. So GTIN plus lot code, GTIN plus serial number, right? More fine-grained information. So where that all sort of comes together in an ask of industry, if you look at it that way, one of the biggest unlocks to make all of that sort of future state possible is getting 2D barcodes, right? Using supply chain data, GS1 data, to be activated at retail point of sale. So getting major retailers that, depending on how you look at them, one opinion is retail is a rather robust data creation machine, right? All of those sales transactions, all the value of the consumer interaction with the products, sales data by region, what products are moving through different avenues of retail, right? If they enable the ability to read a 2D barcode and drive that same point of sale use case as the 1D, that can then give the sense of confidence, the commitment, and so on for brands, people putting products in the market, also to move in that direction with confidence. This is still going to work at point of sale. My products will still scan. They'll still move through the checkout lines as I expect. But now I can move into that future state and then start to add a lot of this additional really high valuable business data, right? So for a brand, let's imagine every bagged salad, right, in a retail store. To additionally have the lot code on every single one of those products accurately, right? That provides a huge opportunity anywhere it's scanned to make sure that that data is pulled forward. So we're talking about traceability, FISMA, things like this. Having the lot code not only known to the systems through data exchange, but available directly on the product as well, right, is another opportunity to make sure that it's never lost, discarded, misplaced, mischaracterized, something like that. And again, getting retail point of sale, that main point where product data is captured, right? That's the primary place where that takes place. Enabled for 2D, giving brands the confidence to make the investment in more granular data, right? It is a step change to go from static UPC barcode to a 2D with a lot code, which is a much smaller grouping of products, right? The printing technology does have to adjust to that. But for brands to make that step and really put that additional data out there for the marketplace to take advantage of and drive processes, it all comes down to retailer commitment, right? So that's why we are so focused on 2D at retail point of sale. The Sunrise 2027 initiative is, as we look at all of those complicated cascading pieces of upgrades and things like that, that is the biggest one that's going to unlock the sort of technology enablement and sense of confidence for brands to get us to that future state where all that data is accessible.
We will be looking at Sunrise 2027 and Digital Link in more detail in our upcoming deep dive. But I've been in this space for quite some time, and it seems to me that we're finally at a pivotal moment for supply chain digitization where multiple elements are coming together. Ned, Matt, final question. If people wanted to learn more and educate themselves on EPCIS, on GS1, on Digital Link, where should they go?
So on the EPCIS front, I think the best place to start to try to get familiar with the standard itself is the GS1.org website. So that's GS1 Global rather than GS1 US. So there you'll find the standard itself, the accompanying document, the core business vocabulary, which includes things like the business process label values that you can have, how you would format things like strings for the identifiers of the locations and objects that you're displaying in the data as well. Digital Link actually being one of those. And there you'll also find certain implementation documents as well, such as the implementation guidelines, as well as some of the more technical documents like the Open API files, the schema files, things of that nature. And I think the implementation guideline does a really good job of kind of talking about some of the things that we mentioned about the implementation aspects of it as well, where things like the role of AIDC in generating the data, and also providing that understanding that you as a business might have to consider new system components like new databases, perhaps new APIs in the implementation of the standard itself. So I think it does a pretty good job of highlighting certain technology considerations that you might have to take into account as an organization if you're really trying to implement the standard most effectively. But again, it also highlights all the different benefits that we kind of already mentioned as far as traceability data, inventory management data, sustainability claims, all the different benefits that the data can provide. It does a really phenomenal job of outlining all those things that we mentioned. And then as far as GS1 US resources, again, we've been working quite significantly for all the industries that we support most heavily, healthcare, the food FISMA 204 use case that we talked about, as well as RFID related technologies in the apparel space. We actually have guidelines that use EPCIS as sort of the data framework for capturing that granular data about the ongoings of products. So, for example, we have application guidelines for DSCSA and how our work group there has sort of adopted the standard to produce their change of ownership documentation. We also have an ever-evolving EPCIS addendum document for our FISMA 204 guidelines. We're actually going to be releasing a new version of that coming out pretty soon to reflect some of the more modern implementations of EPCIS 2.0, including things like sensor data. So we have that document as well. And in the apparel general merchandise sector, one of the documents that we've produced recently is a RFID application document for claims compliance, and it actually has EPCIS event data in there as well to show that as RFID tags are being scanned during the order fulfillment and receiving processes, what that data could look like on both ends of shipping and receiving to kind of verify the accuracy of those processes also. So I guess really you have the GS1 global site for the standards themselves and kind of general implementation guidance, and then here at GS1 US we have have application and industry specific guidelines as well that show, again, the application of the standard towards, say, FSMA 204 or RFID tag, outbound receiving and shipping data.
Yeah, I would add to that to say exactly what Matt said. We're going to our global office for the standards itself, a lot of tools and resources on how to use them. The tools are very helpful also in learning sort of how they function. And then obviously coming to the US, our website for a lot of that US specific guidance against specific FDA regulation, lots of resources as well, like I talked about the 2D barcodes. But another really important consideration is from GS1, you'll receive, here's the global standard, or here's the application of the way to structure the data. Let's say the rule set for how this can all function interoperably. But GS1 will always defer to our partner network of solution providers, right? So we can provide the general information, the high level, here's the data structures, here's the standards, here's the rules, here's what industry has come together to define. But having a really high quality solution provider, either for tagging, labeling, and barcode creation, data capture, scanning, traceability, data collection, storage, exchange, and any sort of traceability solutions, that's where all of that comes together. So it's important to have all of those elements whenever someone's looking at this.
Gentlemen, this was a very illuminating conversation. Our ambition at Kessler is not just to support traceability compliance, but to help build truly connected supply chains. And we see the transition towards an event-centric supply chain model as being absolutely critical in making that a reality. So thank you for taking us through this journey on EPCIS and sharing your knowledge with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Thank you so much.